Pembina, North Dakota, September 1904. The air held the first crisp promise of the brutality to come, a faint razor's edge on the prairie wind that rustled the last of the goldenrod. Along the Tongue River, where the Icelandic settlement had carved out a life from the black soil, a man named Bjarni Þorláksson was doing something deeply strange. He had already raised a standard 20 by 24-foot log cabin, its pine logs chinked tight with mud and moss. It was a respectable structure, solid and square against the vast, empty horizon. But he wasn't finished. Inside this perfectly good cabin, he was building another one. His neighbors, men who had broken the prairie and fought 2 Dakota winters for every bushel of wheat, would stop their wagons on the rutted track to watch. They saw him hauling smaller, milled timbers inside the finished shell, laying a new set of joists, entirely separate from the main floor. Upon these he began erecting a second, smaller room, a 12 by 14-foot box of wood floating inside the larger one. "What in God's name is he doing?" muttered a farmer named Olson to his companion, reining in his horse. "Building a shed for his wife's temper?" The word spread through the small community of sodbusters and shopkeepers. Bjarni the Icelander was building a house inside his house. Nathaniel Ruthven, the Pembina County land assessor, made a special trip out from the county seat. A man of ledgers and legal descriptions, Ruthven saw the world in terms of taxable property. He stood with his hands on his hips, a frown etched into his face as he watched Bjarni carefully fitting the inner walls. "It's madness," Ruthven declared to anyone who would listen. "Wasting good lumber, wasting space. He's making a 500-square-foot cabin into a space barely big enough for a bed and a stove. The man is a fool, plain and simple." The consensus was swift. The Icelandic farmer, the one with the quiet wife and the old-world accent, was touched by some prairie loneliness, building a monument to his own foolishness. What did this Icelandic builder, a man whose heritage was tied to sod houses on a volcanic island, understand about thermal dynamics that the experienced, practical men of the American frontier had missed? What secret was held within the strange, nested boxes he was so methodically constructing? If you stick with me, I promise you will learn a principle of thermal insulation so profound it could have rewritten the rules of frontier survival. The answer is not just clever. It's a fundamental shift in how one thinks about shelter. Before we unpack the science, if you appreciate stories of quiet genius and hard-won vindication, consider subscribing to this channel. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen to a common problem? Bjarni Þorláksson had arrived in Pembina 2 years prior, part of the wave of Icelanders seeking land and escape from the volcanic ash that had poisoned their pastures back home. He was not a farmer by trade, not a carpenter in the American sense. He was a man of stone and turf, of the deep, practical wisdom of the Skagafjörður region. His hands knew the heft of basalt rocks, the dense insulating properties of layered sod cut from a bog, the precise architecture of a torfbær tvibili, a turf house with a nested inner chamber. He had spent his youth building these structures, which looked more like green hills than houses, their wooden cores buried deep within earthen walls. He understood that you didn't fight the North Atlantic wind, you hid from it. His first winter in North Dakota had been a brutal education. He, his wife Lilia, and their 2 small children, Jan and Katrine, had spent it in a hastily built, single-walled cabin, a structure considered standard for the region. That winter, the cold was not an element, it was a predator. It was a physical presence that seeped through the walls, no matter how much cottonwood they fed the stove. The cold was a thief that stole the breath from your lungs as you slept and left a layer of hoarfrost on your blankets. That was the winter a neighbor's brand new iron plowshare, resting by his door, cracked at the frog with a sound like a rifle shot when he tried to move it. It was the winter the pastor, recording a baptism, watched the ink in his pen freeze solid in the middle of writing a child's name. Most chillingly, Bjarni's son, Jan, had come back from the one-room schoolhouse, hung his thick wool cap on a peg by the door, and the family later heard a faint tink. The frozen wool had become so brittle it had cracked clean across the crown, falling to the floor in 2 pieces. They had survived, but only just. Lilja's cough had lasted until May. The children had slept in their coats for 4 straight months. Bjarni swore they would not endure another winter like that. He would not fight the Dakota wind. He would hide from it. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin was a well-known, if miserably accepted, fact of life. The problem wasn't poor construction. These men were skilled builders. The problem was physics. A standard log cabin, even one with well-chinked walls, was a single envelope against the abyss. The enemy was heat transfer, happening in 3 relentless ways. First, conduction. The logs themselves, solid matter, were a direct bridge from the warm interior to the Arctic exterior. A pine log has an R value of about 1.25 per inch. An 8-inch log wall, therefore, offered a total insulation value of roughly R10. Against a temperature differential of 100 degrees, 70 inside, 30 outside, that wall was little more than a sieve for BTUs. The heat simply bled through the wood, molecule by molecule. Second, convection. Cold air is denser than warm air. Every tiny crack, every gap in the chinking, every poorly fitted window frame or door jamb became an engine of misery. Cold, heavy air would pour in at the floor, pushing the precious warm air from the stove up and out through gaps in the ceiling and roof. You could feel it as a constant, ankle-biting draft. Families would stuff rags, newspapers, anything they could find into these gaps, fighting a losing battle against the unceasing infiltration of cold. This is why candles would flicker and die in a supposedly sealed room, starved of oxygen by the drafts that fed the fire, but chilled the people. Third, radiation. Every warm object, including a human body, radiates heat to colder objects around it. Sitting near a single-pane window or a poorly insulated wall, you would feel a chill, even if the air in the room was warm. Your body was literally radiating its precious warmth directly to the frozen glass and wood. The result was a constant, exhausting war for warmth. A family might burn through a dozen cords of wood in a single winter, the potbelly stove glowing cherry red around the clock. Yet the corners of the room would remain freezing. Water buckets would ice over just 10 feet from the fire. Life shrank to a small, huddled circle of warmth, while the rest of the house remained a frigid, barely tolerable shell. This was the reality Bjarni Þorláksson refused to accept for a second time. So in the autumn of 1904, he began his strange work. The outer shell, the 20 by 24-foot cabin, was conventional. He felled the trees, stripped the bark, and notched the corners with the skill of any of his neighbors. He chinked it meticulously. But then his methods diverged. He did not lay a floor across the entire foundation. Instead, he built up the outer walls and put on a roof, creating a large, empty, roofed enclosure. Inside this space, he laid a new, completely independent set of floor joists. They did not touch the outer walls. They rested on their own footings, creating a floating foundation. On top of this, he began to build the inner room, a 12 by 14-foot cabin within a cabin. The space between the inner wall and the outer wall was a consistent 3 feet on all 4 sides. Nathaniel Ruthven returned in October, clipboard in hand, his expression a mixture of bureaucratic suspicion and personal offense. "Mr. Þorláksson," he began, his voice dry as dust, "I am here to finalize the assessment on this structure. My records show a single-family dwelling. What you have built here appears to be a duplex, a house with a separate, unattached interior residence." Bjarni, who was on a ladder packing the 3-foot gap between the walls, paused. He looked down at the assessor. "It is one house," he said, his Icelandic accent turning the words soft. "It is two distinct structures under one roof," Ruthven countered, tapping his pencil on his clipboard. "One inside the other. The county code is clear. That constitutes a multi-family dwelling. I'm afraid your tax assessment will have to be adjusted accordingly." He made a show of calculating. "The base rate plus the duplex modification, it will be triple the standard assessment. It's due in April." The financial penalty was a crippling blow. Triple the tax could mean losing the farm. Any other man might have argued, pleaded, or cursed. Bjarni simply looked at Ruthven, then at the gray sky, then back at the wall he was building. "I see," he said, and nothing more. He turned back to his work. The work was methodical and immense. He and Lilja, and even little Jan, spent weeks gathering the insulating material. They collected vast quantities of sphagnum moss from the marshy areas near the river, laying it out on canvases to dry in the weak autumn sun until it was light and fluffy. He traded with the few remaining Métis hunters for old, worn-out reindeer hides, which were prized for their hollow hair fibers that trapped air. He packed this mixture, layers of dry moss, then a layer of hide, then more moss, into the 3-foot cavity between the walls. He packed it from floor to ceiling, creating a thick, breathable, yet incredibly effective blanket of insulation around his family's future living space. Finally, he installed a single, small potbelly stove, not in the large outer room, but in the tiny inner one. The stovepipe went straight up, through the ceiling of the inner room, and then through the roof of the outer cabin, the only physical connection between the two structures. To his neighbors, it looked like a tremendous waste. He had reduced a spacious 480-square-foot cabin to a cramped 168-square-foot room. He had spent a fortune in time and effort to build what amounted to a closet. The mockery was relentless, though spoken quietly behind his back. Þorláksson's folly, they called it. The physics Bjarni understood from his ancestors was devastatingly simple. He hadn't built a house with thick walls. He had built a system. The outer 20 by 24-foot cabin was not the house. It was the first line of defense, a sacrificial layer. Its job was not to be warm, but simply to be not Arctic. Its purpose was to stop the wind and create a large pocket of still, unmoving air. Even with its minimal R10 walls, this outer shell could easily maintain a temperature of 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside air plunged to 40 degrees with a howling wind. The wind chill, the most brutal killer on the plains, was completely eliminated. The temperature inside that outer buffer zone was a stable, windless 15 degrees. The real magic was in the second layer. The 3-foot gap packed with dry moss and reindeer hide was an insulating powerhouse. Modern analysis shows that this combination would have created an R value of at least R24, a number that would be respectable in a modern home, and was almost unheard of in 1904. This R24 insulation wasn't fighting a 100-degree temperature difference between a warm room and 40-degree air. It was only fighting the difference between the desired 65-degree inner room and the calm 15-degree air of the buffer zone. This was a battle it could easily win. The final piece of the puzzle was scale. Heating a large, leaky 480-square-foot cabin from 40 degrees to a livable temperature required an enormous amount of energy, tens of thousands of BTUs per hour. But heating a tiny, super-insulated 168-square-foot room with a volume of just 1,344 cubic feet, from a starting point of 15 degrees, required a shockingly small amount of energy. A simple calculation shows the heating load would be around 1,200 BTUs per hour. A small potbelly stove burning just a few logs of wood could easily produce 5,000 to 10,000 BTUs, meaning it would only need to be run at a fraction of its capacity. Bjarni had not tried to heat the prairie. He had shrunk the battlefield to a small, defensible fortress of warmth. The inner room would stay a comfortable 65 degrees, tracking a consistent 30 to 35 degrees warmer than the outer buffer room, which was itself 50 degrees warmer than the outside air. The winter arrived in January, not with a gentle snow, but with a roar. A polar outbreak, a mass of Arctic air slid down from Hudson Bay and settled over the Red River Valley. For 14 consecutive nights, the mercury did not rise above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind blew relentlessly from the north at 30 miles per hour, stripping the insulating snow off the open plains and driving the wind chill to unimaginable levels. Kerosene flames in lamps burned with a strange, blue edge, starved for oxygen in the dense, frigid air. It was a time of pure survival, neighbors huddled in their cabins, burning wood at a frantic pace. The constant drafts were like icy knives. In the Olson house, the water in a bucket just 6 feet from their roaring stove froze solid overnight. McGregor, the blacksmith, found his tools so brittle with cold he couldn't risk striking them, for fear they would shatter. Families wore every layer of clothing they owned, their breath pluming in their own homes. Life became a desperate, shivering ordeal. Inside Bjarni Þorláksson's nested cabin, it was another world. The outer buffer room was cold, to be sure. A thin layer of frost coated the inside of the main cabin's walls, but the air was dead still. The temperature hovered at a steady 18 degrees Fahrenheit. It was like a vast, calm, indoor winter. But to get to the family, you had to pass through a second, smaller doorway. Stepping through that inner door was like stepping from January into late September. The air in the 12 by 14-foot room was warm and dry. The little potbelly stove radiated a gentle, steady heat, consuming a surprisingly small amount of wood. Lilia worked at her loom in the corner, her fingers nimble and warm. The children, Jan and Katrine, sat on a sheepskin rug on the floor, playing a game with carved wooden animals, dressed in simple wool shirts. There were no drafts. The air was still and quiet. The ultimate proof of this alternate reality sat on a small shelf on the inner wall. It was a crock of skyr, the thick, tangy Icelandic yogurt that Lilia made every week. It was smooth, creamy, and perfect. In every other cabin across the settlement, milk and cream were a constant struggle. They would sour, separate, and freeze if left anywhere but directly beside the stove. Here, in this island of warmth, the delicate culture of the skyer remained alive and undisturbed through the entire 2-week siege of cold. It was a small, domestic miracle that spoke volumes. The cold had not been allowed entry. On the 10th day of the polar outbreak, Nathaniel Ruthven was making his rounds, a miserable task of checking on tax-delinquent properties even in the brutal cold. His sleigh, the only way to travel, was taking a beating on the frozen, wind-scoured ground. As he turned into the lane leading to Bjarni Þorláksson's farm, he heard a sharp crack, like a gunshot. The sleigh lurched violently, and the right runner collapsed. It had snapped clean in two. Stranded, with the wind clawing at him and the sun already low in the sky, Ruthven knew he was in serious trouble. His only hope was the strange cabin ahead. He staggered towards it, his face numb, his lungs aching with every breath. He needed to use their telephone to call for help from a neighbor with a sturdier wagon. He pounded on the outer door. Bjarni opened it. Ruthven practically fell inside, overwhelmed by the sudden absence of wind. He found himself in a large, cold, dim space. It was freezing, but the stillness was a profound relief. "My sled runner, it broke," Ruthven stammered, his words clumsy from the cold. "I need to telephone." "Of course," Bjarni said calmly. "The telephone is inside. Come." Ruthven was confused. Inside? He was already inside. Then Bjarni turned and led him towards the center of the large, cold room, to the door of the smaller structure within. Bjarni ducked through the low doorway and held it open. Puzzled, Ruthven followed, stooping to enter. The vindication was not an argument. It was a physical shock. He stepped from the still 18-degree air of the buffer zone into a wall of soft, dry, 65-degree warmth. The sensation was so abrupt, so total, it made him gasp. The air felt thick and gentle on his frozen cheeks. He stopped, blinking, as his eyes adjusted. He saw the scene, the small, cozy room, the gentle glow of the stove. Lilia looking up from her loom with a calm smile. The two children playing on the floor in their shirt sleeves. He saw the crock of skyer on the shelf. He saw the utter, unbelievable normalcy of it all. He stood there, a man bundled in 3 layers of wool, a heavy buffalo coat, and a fur hat, while this family existed in a bubble of perpetual autumn. He looked at the single, small stove, barely idling. He looked at the modest pile of wood next to it, enough for a day, not an hour. He looked at the walls, which felt faintly warm to the touch. He had expected to feel the biting cold radiating from them, the telltale sign of a losing battle. He reached out a bare hand and laid his palm flat against the inner wooden wall. He expected to feel the deep, penetrating chill of a North Dakota winter. Instead, he felt only the neutral warmth of the room itself. The cold wasn't there. It had been stopped, somewhere in the 3 feet of space between this wall and the outside world. The tax assessor slowly unwound the scarf from his face. The color was draining from his own cheeks, not from cold, but from astonishment. He looked at Bjarni, who was simply waiting patiently. "My God, Þorláksson," Ruthven whispered, his voice full of an awe that bordered on reverence. He finally understood. He wasn't standing in a duplex. He was standing in the most advanced piece of thermal engineering in the entire state of North Dakota. "You didn't build a house inside a house," he said, the realization crystallizing into a single, perfect metaphor. "You built a harbor in the heart of winter." Ruthven used the telephone, but he stayed for 2 hours, sipping hot coffee and slowly shedding layers, his mind reeling. He listened as Bjarni, in his quiet, simple way, explained the principle. He didn't use terms like R-value or BTUs. He spoke of his grandfather's house in Skagafjörður. "You do not ask a wall to fight the whole winter," Bjarni explained. "It is too much. You ask the first wall to fight the wind. You ask the space between to be still. Then you ask the inner wall only to hold the warmth of your family. It is an easier job." When a neighbor finally arrived for him, Ruthven left a changed man. The first thing he did upon returning to Pembina was march into the county records office and tear up Bjarni Þorláksson's triple-rate tax assessment. He refiled it as a single-family dwelling with non-standard insulation methods. The story of Ruthven's broken sled and the shirt-sleeve miracle inside Þorláksson's folly spread like wildfire through the Icelandic community. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was gospel. Farmers came, not to mock, but to learn. Bjarni, who had never argued with his critics, now patiently answered every question. He drew diagrams on scraps of wood, showing the floating inner joists, the 3-foot gap, the placement of the stove. In March of 1905, the story reached the ears of an editor at the Lögberg, the Icelandic language weekly newspaper published in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which served the entire diaspora of Western Icelanders. They sent a writer and an illustrator. The resulting article, complete with a detailed cross-section diagram of Bjarni's nested cabin, was a sensation. It gave the technique a name, the Þorláksson thermal envelope. The validation was swift and practical. That summer, 8 other Icelandic farm families across Pembina and neighboring Cavalier County began building their own nested cabins. Some were new builds, others were retrofits, with smaller rooms being constructed inside existing cabins. They followed Bjarni's model, gathering moss, insulating the gap, and moving their stoves into the smaller, protected core. The fuel savings were immediate and staggering. Families that had burned 10 to 15 cords of wood to survive a winter now found that 3 or 4 were more than sufficient. More importantly, They experienced a level of comfort they had never thought possible. The winter of 1905-1906 was just as cold, but for 9 families, it was no longer a period of shivering survival. It was just a season. The quiet man from Skagafjörður had anticipated a core principle of modern building science by nearly a century. His nested cabin was a direct ancestor of the double-stud walls and outsolation techniques used in today's high-performance passive houses. The concept of decoupling the interior conditioned space from the exterior structural shell with a significant thermal break is now the gold standard in cold climate construction. Bjarni Þorláksson, using moss, hide, and ancestral memory, had created a high-performance home on the frozen prairie. In the end, the story of Bjarni's cabin is a profound lesson in problem solving. Faced with an overwhelming force, his neighbors had redoubled their efforts, fighting a conventional war they were destined to lose. They burned more wood, they chinked more cracks, they piled on more blankets, they tried to heat their entire cabins against the full fury of a Dakota winter. Bjarni Þorláksson did not. He refused to fight on those terms. He understood that the real challenge wasn't heating the house, it was protecting a small bubble of warmth. He didn't heat the cabin against winter. He built a smaller room inside and asked the outer walls to simply be the buffer. He redefined the problem, shrinking it to a scale where it could be easily solved with the resources he had. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective solution isn't a bigger hammer, but a smaller, more intelligently protected space. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and frontier resilience as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. And let us know in the comments, what other historical technologies deserve more recognition? The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and modern analysis. Any application of these or similar building techniques today should be done in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.